Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiatore. Now back scabbards, or wearing the sword on the back. We all know that wearing the sword on the back is absolutely beloved of Hollywood, and it's done in huge numbers. So we'll come to this issue in a second. It's done with huge numbers of Asian swords in movies. And of course, it's done with European swords, famously in Braveheart, for example, with all sorts of issues that are related to that, which I'll come back to in a second. So it is shown with both Asian swords, it's shown with even African swords when we're looking at things like the Crusades and things happening in North Africa. It's shown with European swords. And at some point, I'm sure it's been done in a Western as well, so even probably with American swords. But as me and many other people who've spoken about in previous videos, and I know that Shad has done a video about back scabbards, but I'll circumvent that for the purposes of this video. And most of us highlight the point that this wasn't a thing, this wasn't historical. Well, that's not really correct. And I think that most of us have conceded in the past that occasionally it was done, it just wasn't generally a thing. And I do want to reiterate before I go a little bit further into this topic that that is generally speaking true, is that most of the time, in most of the world, throughout most of history, in most cultures, with most swords, swords were worn in some form of around midriff or waist level or hip level. Okay, so generally speaking, if we're looking at Japanese swords with a katana, or even larger forms like this, which is what you might call a odashi maybe, or okatana, I think more than odashi, they are usually worn through the sash, through the obi. If we're looking at European swords, they're usually worn hung from a belt, okay, usually hung quite low down, in fact, usually hanging down at about this kind of level, sort of on the thigh, essentially. A bit like a kind of gun holster, a kind of Wild West gun holster height. If we look at military swords from the 18th, 19th centuries, they're usually worn either vertical or hanging at a slight angle, again at kind of thigh height. One of the reasons, incidentally, for having the sword not necessarily high up, but having it a little bit lower down is very often if you're riding a horse, it actually is more comfortable and more convenient to have the sabre, for example, hanging at thigh height, jangling down here when you're riding on a horse. And it's also quicker and easier to draw it because it gives you more, that essentially puts the scabbard further away from your maximum height that you can lift your hands to. Which means that if you have a long bladed sword like the rapier behind me here, it means that you can draw a very long blade out and not have an issue. With shorter blades, you can of course wear them higher up. So the most extreme example probably is the Roman gladius, which is worn on the right hand side, at least by by legionaries, not necessarily by officers. They tended to wear them on the other side. But the Roman sword famously is worn on this side, but you can draw it still from that side because of course it's a short bladed sword. So blade length is very important even when you're wearing the sword around the middle height, so around your waist or around your hips or kind of groin height, okay? But coming back to wearing it on the back, now the first thing to say is it was done historically, okay? Now, by and large, I'm only going to refer to Asian examples here, primarily Chinese and Japanese, but it undoubtedly was done in some other parts of Asia, possibly in the Philippines, for example, Southeast Asia, possibly in Korea. But the clear, absolute, categorical, in fact, photographic evidence we have of these sorts of swords, of Asian swords, not these sorts of swords, but of Asian swords particularly from Japan and China, being worn on the back are from the 19th century, when of course photography had been invented, so there's no real arguing about it. But we do know that it was done earlier than that as well, because we have artwork from obviously both those countries, both those areas, that show very occasionally show swords worn on the back. Now in Japan, at least if we go back in time, if we go to maybe the 15th, 16th century, it does seem that swords that were occasionally at least carried on the back, we don't know that they were necessarily drawn from the back because of the issue that I've mentioned, is the big nodashi. And it does seem that there might be a very specific context for wearing swords on the back some of the time. If we look at the examples that we've got from China and Japan in the 19th century, it does seem that maybe some of it is to do with troops who might have to be very nimble on their feet, very quick on their feet, and don't want a sword jangling around down here. Possibly the sword, as is often the case in history, was not their primary weapon. Their primary weapon might be a gun or a bow or a pike or spear, some form of polearm or missile weapon. And so therefore the sword, you want the sword to be out of the way so that you're very mobile on your feet. Okay. Now, as mentioned, there are some issues with the size of the weapon. So ironically, despite the fact that perhaps the earliest documented examples we've got of the Japanese swords being worn on the back are the nodashi, one of the reasons why we object to, for example, Mel Gibson in Braveheart wearing a large two-handed sword on the back is how do you get the sword out? And if you watch the movie Braveheart, you'll see that the sword magically appears in his hand, and then it's back in its scabbard, and then it's in his hand. Sometimes it changes into a warhammer miraculously between cutscenes. But the point is that it's very difficult to get a blade out from being worn on your back if the blade is over a certain length. And you'll see that with this O katana from Dynasty Forge, incidentally, I would have to pull the scabbard down quite low, and I can just about get it out. But that's not very convenient. Now, it is possible, and there might be a reason why you want to sacrifice convenience of drawing and increase your convenience of wearing, so get it out of the way of your legs for the aforementioned reasons. Say, for example, we're skirmishing in an area where there's a lot of high crops or swamp or something like that, so I don't want the sword down in the water or the mud or getting tangled up with foliage, maybe in the jungle. I want the sword up and away from the damp and the mud and the dirt, but equally out of the way so that I'm nimble on my feet and I'm able to climb around and clamber over things. So that might be a reason, and you might decide, well, I want that so much that I'm going to sacrifice the ability to draw my sword very easily and quickly because I just need to get my sword up and out so that I'm nimble on my feet, because my primary purpose might be to run around with a bow or a crossbow or a gun and shoot at people, clambering up rocks, up mountainsides, this kind of stuff. Okay, so you might not want a sword jangling around at kind of thigh height and getting in the way, tripping you up and bashing off rocks and this kind of stuff, or trees or roots or whatever. So there might be reasons why you sacrifice the drawing convenience, but I do want to remind you that one of the important things about a sword, it is a side arm. That is, it's a weapon which is there when you need it, and you can quickly get out and ready to use it. Because what's in your hands most of the time is not the sword. What's in your hands is the bow or the pike or the gun or whatever. So it has to be a really good reason that you put the sword on your back. And I can't necessarily say for a specific historical example what their reason was. And we do know, for example, and so to now turn to Chinese examples, we do know that in the Taiping Rebellion and in the Boxer Rebellion, as they were known at the time, so uprisings basically against the Chinese government in the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, where there were lots of rebels, for want of calling them, obviously the politics are very complicated, but I'll just call them rebels for now, not wanting to offend. If you particularly support the Boxer Rebellion, I don't want to offend you, but anyway, I'll just call them rebels for now. The people who were uprising, essentially, they often wore, not often I will say, but they sometimes wore swords on their backs. And I can't specifically say for example in the Boxer Rebellion, I can't specifically tell you why they wore swords on their backs sometimes, but they did, and we have photographic evidence for it. So that's kind of the deal breaker, isn't it? We know that it happened. Now, the one thing I've just spoken about is the length of the sword and unsheathing. It should be pointed out that in some cases, some of the swords being pictured worn on the back are short enough, they're sort of wakizashi length, or kind of, mesa length, essentially, dowel length, where you can pull the sword out from over the shoulder because the blade is short enough to be able to do that. With a sword of this long, it's particularly inconvenient. But with a shorter, a dowel or a mesa length blade, maybe 27, 28 inches long, it becomes a lot easier. This is about 33 inches long, so it's a little bit too long. So there we go. Really, that's what I want to say on the matter. We absolutely know categorically that swords were worn on the back sometimes, not usually, but sometimes, certainly in Asia. I'm not going to address Europe or Africa or America or anywhere else right now, but in Asia, particularly and specifically, unquestionably in Japan and China, swords were occasionally worn on the back for specific reasons, but we don't necessarily know what those specific reasons were. They could have been just for transport purposes, not necessarily, that wasn't necessarily the ready kind of the way you'd have it in battle. They might have moved it from the back to the side if they expected action. They may have just been on the back in the same way that a Roman soldier's gear was, a lot of it was on their back because it was just for transportation. Who knows? It could be for the aforementioned landscape reasons. It could be because they were fighting in, you know, climbing over things, whether it's mountainous, rocky area or jungle or swamp. All of these sorts of environmental reasons why they might have worn them on their back. Or it could have been for some other reason that I haven't mentioned or thought of. So that's really to say that we know that in Asia, particularly in China and Japan, swords were sometimes worn on the back for reasons sometimes perhaps we can guess at and sometimes we don't know. But what I also want to reiterate is that they were usually not worn on the back, and they must have had a very specific reason for wearing them on the back. And finally, swords were not worn on the back anything like as often as Hollywood movies would have you think. Thanks for watching, give us a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you soon for another video on Scholar Gladiatore channel. Cheers folks! Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers folks!